part. More people join there, but once they join. But so usually we begin, sometimes we begin different ways, but I think it's been nice lately since we're covering this topic to begin with just slowly going through the verse, right? Of refuge and bodhicitta as our motivation. I'm pretty sure, I think that verse comes from Atisha, actually. I think it was Atisha who brought that, who popularized that verse in Tibet. And actually, it's weird, right? That one verse, you could cover the whole, like this, you could discuss all the topics from the Uttara Tantra, and it covered many different things. But usually when it's translated to English, right, it says, I go for refuge until I'm enlightened, right? So actually to start, it'll start just a little bit. I was actually just thinking about it. So start with the I go for refuge, right? And if we don't think about it, then we just say I go for refuge, right? But actually, sometimes in some of the Majjhimaka texts, they say that the I can appear in three different ways to us, or to beings, to sentient beings. One is an inherently existent I. Actually, there are more than three, really, but they summarize it as three. So one would be the inherently existent I. Which doesn't exist. Right? It appears to our mind, but in that sense, it's like a hallucination. It appears to our mind as though it exists, but it doesn't exist. Then there's a merely labeled I, which does exist. And then there's an I that's not differentiated, it's not clarified. And they sometimes almost will give the example of if when the Buddha says in a past life I was so and so, he's not clarifying, he's not specifying whether that's the merely labeled I or the inherently existent I. It's kind of a unspecified. So it's kind of funny, right? So if you say I go for refuge, what's appearing to our mind as I who's going for refuge? And for ordinary people, we don't differentiate actually the merely labeled I from the inherently existent I. We actually don't notice the difference. We mix them together. Because once you recognize the I that's merely labeled, then that will allow us to realize its ultimate nature is emptiness. Just check, right, when we're going to go for refuge, what's the nature of the I who's going for refuge? Check your own experience. So I go for refuge until I'm enlightened. So when you say that, when you think I go for refuge until I'm enlightened, what is enlightened? Since we're basing this on the Uttara Tantra, right? Enlightened mainly means, right, a Dharmakaya. In one sense, it means having fully realized the nature of mind, and thereby having purified all the stains or taints. And so the I who goes for refuge is a being who has the capacity to realize the nature of it, to purify all the stains or taints that obstruct one from seeing the true nature. Amazing, right? I saw that eye. It's not somebody else's eye, it's one's own. Can become enlightened with no imprints even of mental afflictions. They're capable of blissfully realizing ultimate truth and simultaneously being omniscient. That potential is there in the mind. So until I achieve that, right, it's we'll focus on result and refuge. So until I achieve that, I am turning for refuge, meaning I'm moving towards, I'm trying to become the Buddha. And actualize the Dharma within my own continuum, right? That's what the Dharma is, right? In this sense, the Dharma is a realization that one is striving to achieve within one's own mind, in one's own experience. And the Sangha, which here means I'm striving to become an Arya Bodhisattva Sangha, who has knowledge of the ultimate nature, reality, and freedom. Saying until I achieve Buddha's enlightenment, right? Taking refuge in the sense that I'm striving to actualize the Buddha in my own continuum, the Dharma in my own continuum, the Sangha in my own continuum. And how will I do that? Through the practices of giving and the other perfections. I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. So that's actually, there's aspiring bodhicitta, right? Wishing to become enlightened. But when you say through practice in the six perfections, that's engaging bodhicitta. So it means I'll actually not just wish to become enlightened, but I'll do the practices of the six perfections. And even as we can commit, right, in our own mind. So first of all, what does it mean to be a perfection? First of all, it has to arise out of great compassion and the unusual attitude, special attitude, right, that takes responsibility for the welfare of all beings. And that has bodhicitta motivation. And then also has an awareness of emptiness. So even as we can think, even as I study today, contemplate today's teaching on the Uttara Tantra, I recognize, actually, if I'm studying the Uttara Tantra, then like the studier, the studied, and the act of studying, like the three spheres, are mutually dependent and therefore empty of inherent existence. And so even the act of studying is done with an awareness of the emptiness of the eye, of the object, and of the action studying. We do so with the wish to understand in order to benefit all beings. So that's a give and share the Dharma with others in the future. That's generosity. And so we concentrate during the teaching, that's the perfection of concentration. If we ask questions and inquire and contemplate and wonder, that's the perfection of wisdom. When it's a difficult topic, we continue to persevere, that's perfection of patience. When we act in ethical manner while studying, the perfection of ethics. And we put effort into our study, right? Perfection of joyous effort. So I'll engage in the practice of the six perfections, even as I'm studying, right, with the wish to benefit all beings. So awareness of the emptiness, the three spheres. And then this very act of studying becomes a cause for one's own achievement of Buddhahood. So that's the verse, right? We do that verse in each activity, then that activity becomes a cause. If we actually get the meaning of it, then that activity, whatever it might be, becomes a cause of achieving Buddhahood. So I'll just do the verse one more time slowly, kind of try to imbue into our minds those qualities. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened. So the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving, the other or generosity, and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. Really, so that verse, you could I actually think that verse, you could study that for a year or something, have a whole class, you could go over that verse for a year and it wouldn't be done, actually, all the layers and meaning of that one verse. But then we'll come back to our text, the actual Maitreya's Sublime Continuum, or Uttara Tantra. And for those who are following along on the text, we're on page 5. And we left off at this point where it says, Maitreya had covered that we just covered remember there are 7 Vajra topics in this text. The first 3 are the Buddha jewel, Dharma jewel, and Sangha jewel. So Maitreya just covered those. We completed that section of the text. We're going to still look at those topics, but we've covered that section of the text now. And then Maitreya brings up the next 4 Vajra topics, right, of the 7, so the last 4. So he says, essentially he's saying, Tathagata Garbha, right, the essence of a Tathagata, or the seed of a Tathagata, the Buddha nature, is the 4th Vajra topic, right? And then he says, enlightenment, the qualities and the activities or deeds of a conqueror. So those are the next 4, right? And he says those are the, we're going to get into this more, we'll analyze it more, but he basically says, those are the causes and conditions. In verse 123, it says here, those are the causes and conditions from which the virtuous 3 jewels arise as and are objects of those who realize the ultimate. So he's saying, those 3, right, that you have Buddha nature, and we're going to get into this later with an interesting commentary, but what he says is Buddha nature is the cause, the substantial cause, the main cause of your achieving Buddhahood, but you need the cooperative conditions of somebody else's having achieved enlightenment and having the qualities and deeds of the Buddha in order to help you awaken your own Buddha nature so that you can become enlightened, right? And then he says the 3 jewels and its lineage. Lineage is a reference to Buddha nature, right? So the 3 jewels and its lineage are objects only of those all-seeing ones, meaning Buddhas. These 4 aspects in their respective order are inconceivable by way of 4 reasons. And so now I left off mentioning these 4, which I was laughing last time because I was saying, so they're inconceivable, and I'll try to explain them, right? It's kind of silly in a way. It's like I was laughing at home going, how to explain the inconceivable. But we'll explore it and see. But part of what's interesting there, right, is I said this last time a little bit. Anyway, here it is. He said, Gimi Khentrem Sheshwada, he said, inconceivable here means difficult to comprehend or inscrutable, right? And and we'll explore this more, but it relates to, I mentioned this very briefly last night. It relates to the point in the Prasangika Madhyamaka, right? The middle way, the consequentialist middle way school, that there are no self-existent causes or effects, yet causality functions. And what we're getting at here is that to understand these four inconceivable points, part of what's difficult about them is that we have to understand them properly. One has to understand the harmony of conventional truth and ultimate truth, which is difficult to understand. And if I've made every mistake, I think, in these topics possible. So if you think it's easy, then you haven't understood it. I've made that mistake. So there's a point where you think, oh, that's really simple. It's conventional truth. That's good. It means we're trying, but it's not simple. It's difficult. I mean, Maitreya himself is saying it's difficult to understand. It's inscrutable. And I mentioned this last time. Lama Tsongkhapa, right? Like there was a point in his life where he thought he understood it early in life, and then Manjushri said to him, "No, you didn't understand it." Right? He spent years in retreat. You think of it that way. Lama Tsongkhapa, right, who's the founder of the Gelugpa tradition, teacher of the first Dalai Lama, he did years of retreat actually. Like I think 4, I can't remember the exact number, something like 4 years of retreat. He still hadn't understood it. And he had studied with his teacher for years. And I remember in the there's a beautiful biography of Lama Tsongkhapa that Thupten Jinpa did. He was a wonderful scholar and translator the Dalai Lama. And Thupten Jinpa he said something funny in the introduction to it, where he said, he's a Larampa Geshe. He finished his studies at the monastery and became a Geshe and was one of the prominent scholar. And he said when he was working on the biography of Lama Tsongkhapa, he thought when he finished his studies to become a Geshe, you have to debate in front of everybody. And, he kind of said he thought he understood Madhyamaka because he could debate it and got his degree and having studied it, And then he looked at Lama Tsongkhapa's biography and he said, I must be missing something, because he was like, Lama Tsongkhapa spent a lot longer and still said he hadn't understood it correctly, until he did. And so then Thupten Jinpa said he was kind of joking, I think, that he had more work to do. He realized there's something, but anyway, okay, so these 4 inscrutable points in our text, the first one says, because the basic element is pure, yet has afflictions, right? So it means your Buddha nature, right, is your and everybody's, right? All sentient beings have Buddha nature, which is naturally pure, yet it's mixed with the afflictions. So what does that mean, right? Like, and actually think of somebody, you think of yourself, right? And this is true, or think of somebody who you think of as particularly obscured, right? Particularly confused. You say, so they have totally pure Buddha nature, yet their Buddha nature is mixed with afflictions. What does that mean? And I'll share a little more about this first point. Right. What is it if you say this is inscrutable, right? The mind of sentient beings is primordially pure, yet tainted. How can something be both primordially pure and tainted? And in the commentaries on this, they make various points to reflect on. These aren't an answer to the inscrutable, but they're points to contemplate. Conventionally, right, from a perspective of conventional, because we talked about, right, I was saying part of understanding these inscrutable points is understanding the nature of conventional reality and how it relates to the nature of ultimate truth. And again, just we want to continue with difficult points. Conventional truth and ultimate truth are of one nature, but they're not the same thing. Like, so, for example, like, what does that mean, right? Something can be of the same nature, but not identical. Like, I'll give an example. Venerable Damchu is a nun. Right? So being a nun and being Venerable Damchu are of one nature, but that's not identical. I'm sure you weren't born a nun. So if you're not, so if she wasn't born a nun, then it's not, you can differentiate, right? She became a nun at a certain point, right? And it's one aspect of who she is. I'm just picking an example, right? You have countless examples of this. So 2 things can be of one nature, meaning you can't separate them, right? And yet they're not identical. They're not the same exact thing. So conventional truth and ultimate truth are of one nature, but they're not the same thing. So conventionally, there are mental afflictions, right? And that's very clear, isn't it? If you look at your own experience, when you're craving, when you're annoyed, when you're whatever, you have mental affliction, right? They're appearing. So we must accept that the contaminated mind and the contaminating mental afflictions exist conventionally, don't they? There's no doubt about that. Because, in other words, conventional existence means it appears to a mind. But when we just say conventional existence, there's different terms in the Madhyamaka text for this. One is, they translate it like, sometimes they translate the truth for that obscures, or the truth for an obscured mind, meaning an obscured here means that it obscures us from seeing something deeper. Right? It's not the final nature of things. So it's a truth in the sense that it's something that's appearing, but it's a kind of truth that obscures, yeah, something deeper, I'll say it that way. So we have to say, for a mind like that, the mental contaminations, right, the mental afflictions appear. So they exist conventionally. And nobody, actually, and nobody says they don't exist conventionally. Like there's no Buddhist text that says they don't exist conventionally, right? And yet, right, this text, the Maitreya's text, and various, he quotes various sutras. In the commentaries, they quote these sutras from the Buddha, say that the mind is naturally pure, or is innately pure, or is primordially pure. So it's the question that you can contemplate, right? And this is something, again, these wise Maitreya teaching, they still going to explore them more throughout the text, and you'll see there are various metaphors and similes to get at them. But there's something to contemplate, right? How is it that my mind, you can think of other people's minds too, but start with your own, right? How is it that my mind's is my mind primordially pure? And at the same time, without a doubt, for ourselves, actually, it's easy to see the mental affliction side, isn't it? Whereas it's not hard to say I have mental afflictions. You can just think of some circumstance where they get stirred up particularly strongly, and you say, of course, I have mental afflictions. And even in that moment, my mind is primordially pure or innately pure. What does that mean, right? And one point is, I'm obviously not going to give some final answer to that because that's inscrutable, but one point that's worth thinking about, I'll just mention, right, is that for an ordinary sentient being, without a doubt, mental afflictions appear. At the same time, the mind's ultimate nature is emptiness. And that emptiness is undifferentiable from the emptiness. That emptiness is of the same taste, we sometimes say, or is undifferentiable from the emptiness of the mind of a Buddha. So the mind, when we say the mind is primordially pure, part of what we're saying is its ultimate nature is free of intrinsic existence. Right? So anyway, that's the point. So you can see there's a relationship between this, this sort of, as he say it in the actual text, he says, the basic element or the Tathagarbha is pure, yet has afflictions, right? So we can contemplate what does that mean, but we're starting to get at something about the meaning. We'll continue on with the other 3 points, and they further elucidate these kind of things. The second point is in the text says, because enlightenment is thoroughly without afflictions, yet has to be purified. It's kind of funny. So again, I'll share some reflections from various commentaries on that. On the one hand, the mind was always innately pure, right? Is what this is saying. Innately pure. And from one perspective, you say, do we mean innately pure of an intrinsic existence? But also what that means in a way is that in the ultimate nature of mind is never tainted, therefore, by the mental afflictions. Right? The mental afflictions, there's a metaphor that's used in some Buddhist texts, right? The mental afflictions appear like clouds in the sky, but the sky is never tainted, right? The sky isn't somehow, what's the word, damaged by clouds. Space is not damaged by clouds, right? So here, the commentary is saying, the mind was always innately pure, yet in the Buddha, it's something that's been purified. Now, that's a simple way of putting it. Now we're going to get even more complicated. On the same point, right? So what does that mean? If the Buddha's mind was always innately pure, yet we say the Buddha purified his or her mind, what does that mean? Similar to the first point, but from the perspective of the result. Then I'll give some more. I'll raise another more complicated question that's part of this. Is the Buddha's mind directly realizing emptiness, right? Any mind that, while it's the part of the mind that's directly realizing emptiness, doesn't perceive mental afflictions for that same mind, right? So for that mind, the aspect of mind that's directly realizing emptiness, it's not seeing any mental afflictions. So for that mind, how can there be mental afflictions that have been removed? If the nature of the mind was always primarily pure and was never tainted by the mental afflictions, what was the nature body of the Buddha, the Svabhavika? What was it purified of? If it's an emptiness, what was it purified of? And Khenchen Rinpoche elaborated a little. He said, the mental afflictions are objects perceived by impure minds, dualistic minds. So how can a non-dualistic mind, which is directly realizing emptiness, perceive or establish mental afflictions which it has been purified of? You see, it's more subtle than the first way of framing this question. So that was how Khenchen Rinpoche framed it more subtly in a way, as he was saying, right? The Buddha's ultimate mind is non-duality, right? And that kind of non-dualistic mind doesn't perceive mental afflictions. Yet we say that mind was purified of mental afflictions, right? So for that mind, how can it perceive mental afflictions and say, oh, I was purified of those? And he's saying it's inscrutable.
I was gonna say then, but there's no I. I love this. Do you know what I mean? If it's been purified of mental afflictions, there is no I. It's empty.
And we have to go back though, because then this, and what you were just getting at, remember earlier I said there are three kinds of ways an I appears. So it raises a question then, like we say that the intrinsically existent I is illusory and never, I mean, it appears, but it never truly existed. Right? The merely labeled I does exist conventionally. The question I'll ask is, does the merely labeled I appear to a non-dualistic mind directly realizing emptiness? It exists, but does it appear to can that mind perceive such an I? These are inscrutable. I mean, it's worth thinking. These are answerable questions, but they're difficult questions, right? Like, because you have to get, when you say there's no I, you have to, I'm just clarifying which kind of I. When you say there's no I, which is there no of?
Well, there's no intrinsic.
Yeah, that's right.
Your I is a label, it's a conventional label, really.
And part of what we're getting is what kind of mind perceives, what part of what these contemplations are getting is what kind of mind perceives an intrinsically existent I, but what kind of mind perceives the merely labeled I even?
I was gonna say, I mean, we talked before about how the Buddha's mind can simultaneously perceive conventional truth and ultimate truth. So wouldn't the Buddha's mind be able to see, could see an I, but would see it as merely labeled, even though he would also see the I, it would just know it was merely labeled, so he could see it.
One point, well, we'll get that later. It comes in this 4 points, exploring that more. But yeah, and one point that's again difficult, I think. I mean, I think what you're saying is reasonable. And one point that's difficult is they also say, for a Buddha's mind, right? because what it's implied in what Ken Termshay was saying here. That, again, remember a minute ago, I said, I used a different example, but it was getting at the same point, or same kind of point, that two things can be of one nature, but not the same, right? And so part of what, Ryan, in relation to what you just said, part of what they raise is that, the Buddha's, this is right, the aspect of the Buddha's mind that's directly perceiving emptiness is of one nature with the aspect of the Buddha's mind that's omniscient, that sees all conventional phenomena, but they're not identical. In the sense that, just like, because they're of one nature, but they're not identical in the sense that you can conceptually, one way of saying is when two things are of one nature but not identical, it means you can that somebody could conceptually differentiate them. So so we could say that, like, the aspect of, so we could say those two aspects of the Buddha's mind are not two different natures, they're of one nature because it's the Buddha's mind. But we could say the aspect of the Buddha's mind that's directly realizing emptiness is perceiving emptiness. The aspect of the Buddha's mind that's seeing the conventional, merely labeled eye is perceiving a conventional reality. And so again, what we're getting at there, though, is just like, how does a Buddha, this is the fourth point, I think it is how does a Buddha simultaneously do both? That's another of these difficult points.
Yeah, pretty hard.
That's sad, like we started, when we were studying with her, we asked her, how do you see things with this ultimate truth and real related? And she said she saw both things at the same time. No, I mean, I'm misquoting you, tell me, but me. And so what, isn't that a duality? That's what I've always had problems.
Isn't what a duality?
If you see both the ultimate truth and conventional truth at the same time, isn't that a duality?
I guess one point is like, anytime, I guess I would argue, debate, I guess, that for any non-Buddha, start with that, because Buddhas are an exception to this, but that for any non-Buddha, all perceptions of conventional reality are dualistic. So like, if you're not a Buddha, then your perception of conventional realities of a conventional object or conventional reality inevitably is dualistic. And what's tricky in a sense is that I think, this is my own debate, is that for somebody who has not seen emptiness directly, all of our perceptions are dualistic, actually. For an Arya Bodhisattva, though, when they're in meditative equipoise on emptiness, they have a non-dualistic experience. Because their experience of emptiness is, they say, like water poured into water, it's non-dualistic. So it depends. So going back to your question, if you, I don't know what Damchu was saying exactly, because I wasn't there, but if you were to say that, so if we were to argue that, if you were to say, well, is Damchu a sentient being, then I would debate, then you would have to say, if she was perceiving conventional reality, it would have to have an element of dualism. If Damcha is a Buddha, if you were to argue that she's a Buddha, then you could say, well, she could simultaneously perceive conventional truth and ultimate truth directly in a non-dualistic manner. So it depends on how you're, it depends on how you view who Damcha is. Maybe is what I would debate. That's my debate.
Didn't you previously, and it fits into what we're discussing right now, when you said realizing emptiness and dependent arising, that's simultaneous, when you can't have emptiness without dependent arising, and you can have dependent arising without emptiness. But the simultaneous perception mind is a kind of, is really a gift. It's there, but it's really covered up. But it's the same thing. It's Or it's, I sense that it's, when you said harmony, it's somehow the harmonic that.
Yeah, and that's getting at this point about how, actually, it's here, well, I'll look it up, but many texts say similar things, but like Lama Tsongkhapa in his three principal aspects of the path says, something like that when what does he say? When they're not when you see them not sort of not sequentially, but it kind of together, then you've understood the view. And yet, just to make it difficult, because that's what we're on, difficult points, there comes a point, right? Like, so there is, if you're contemplating emptiness and dependent arising, right? So you're going, oh, wow, things are, you always sometimes say, because they're dependent, it proves they lack independent nature, so they're empty. Because they arise, it shows there's conventional appearance. And so if you're analyzing that, this is another difficult point to think about in the same topic way we're talking about, is there comes a point as the person is meditating on that, right? They've identified the intrinsically existent I, and they're contemplating how it's dependently arisen, using that as the reason to understand emptiness, for example. And then there comes a point when, one way of putting it in the text, they sometimes say the person realizes emptiness in a manner that cuts off all elaborations. And so I'll just ask, like, this is a difficult point to think about. I think it's answerable again. But when the person realizes emptiness in a manner that cuts off all elaborations, right? Then all that's appearing to their mind is, they call it a mere negation of intrinsic existence. So all that appears to that person's mind in that moment when they're actually realizing emptiness, even conceptually, much less directly, is the mere absence of intrinsic existence. Like they say it's like space, like space. And what's difficult to understand is that that's still. That's why I remember once I was confused by this. I asked McKenzie, I was thinking about that point, and I said, also then, dependent arising emptiness, or like dependent arising as a reason to understand this. So I was saying this, but it can't be the same as emptiness, because emptiness is a mere negation. And he said, you haven't understood it yet. Right. So in other words, in one sense, they're not sequential anymore, right? They're of one nature. They're synonyms. But when you realize emptiness without elaborations, no conventionalities are appearing at that time. It's non-dualistic, so no conventional appearances are appearing. And part of what Lama Tsongkhapa is getting at is that is the meaning of dependent arising, actually. But we don't understand that. It's very difficult to understand how is the appearance to a person's mind of mere negation, mere absence, mere emptiness, right, of intrinsic nature, is the meaning of dependent arising. How is that the meaning of dependent arising? Dependent arising seems like something's arising, right? Like, an apple or a vase or a chair. And Lama Tsongkhapa's, what Lama Tsongkhapa's text is saying is, no, when the person actually has this non-dualistic experience without elaborations, there are no conventional appearances, and yet that's the meaning of dependent arising. So again, that's difficult. It's a difficult point, isn't it?
These are all cool.
Is that related to the idea of like a deep inferential cognition of emptiness, which I think I remember as Holiness saying that he has achieved that, but actually has not completely achieved it, which means it's a very, very advanced state of mind, but it's still a dualistic state of mind to some extent. Is that related to the?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so like what they say actually is that one point is, yes, that's right, that is dualistic. And so if somebody gains on the one point, I guess I'll make a few points. One is a genuine inferential cognition of emptiness is a very profound level of realization. At the same time, definitely, all Buddhist texts agree that that's still a dualistic experience. the dualism is subtle in the sense that it's not dualistic in the way that, like, if like right now, if I'm looking at you, there's a kind of level of dualism. This is a much more subtle dualism. But what they mean by dualistic is that it's not a direct perception of emptiness. You're still perceiving emptiness in a conceptual manner. And so any conceptuality by nature has a kind of dualism to it, is one point. And still, though, at that point, when they describe those experiences, and people have had that experience, and also in the texts and so on, it's similar in the sense it's not a direct perception of emptiness yet, but it's what they say actually is for that person in that moment, other conventionalities are not appearing. The only thing that's appearing to that person's mind is their subtle, correct inferential cognition of emptiness itself. So that, whereas, like, so the person has had a kind of an inferential cognition, so it's conceptual, but this kind of subtle, correct wisdom, understanding emptiness actually is what's appearing to their mind, and nothing else is appearing to their mind at that time. So when we say conceptual, what we mean there is just that there's still an element in that there's an object of mind, in other words, that their mind is realizing, and that object of mind is not a direct perception. It's a correct conceptual understanding. But for that person, there aren't other, or that person isn't thinking about, at that time, that person has no appearance in their mind of the room they're in, or the town they're in, or time of day. They're just perceiving emptiness. So that when we say conceptual, what we mean is that it still has an element of, there's a subtle element of, they're not thinking, oh, I'm seeing emptiness. That would not be this experience, right? But there's a subtle sense of dualism in their way of perceiving that they eventually have to break through meditation. So there is that conceptual component, but it's not conceptuality in the sense that they're thinking, oh wow, how cool it is. That would not be that would not be this. Yeah, then it wouldn't happen. And what they actually say is that when that person arises from that inferential cognition, which is not a direct perception, right? Then they're able to see in a new way that was not true before, how things are dependently arisen. Like, so in other words, when they arise from that inferential cognition, they can, in a different way than they could before, than anybody can before they have that realization, they can understand how their own experience of things is dependently arisen. At one point, I remember Kenstrom, he said at that point, the person hasn't realized emptiness directly, they've not achieved cessation, but he made a point. He said, for that person, they've gained an incredibly powerful experience and tool that will decrease their mental afflictions humongously. In other words, for that person, like when something happens that would ordinarily have made somebody angry or desirous or prideful or jealous or something, like that person it will greatly weaken their mental afflictions. They'll easily sort of have some understanding that will undermine the arising of mental afflictions because of that inferential cognition. Then the person's progress on the path, as Solinus talks about when he mentions that, is to gradually sort of through, you have to unify that with calm abiding, and then work through that. What happens is that the dualistic component, the conceptual component, gets thinner. They sometimes use this metaphor, thinner and thinner, like a piece of cloth that's getting worn away until it finally just it disappears. Yeah, that's sometimes the metaphor that's used over the, and that's the progress. Because as Holiness says, that would be on the path. When one first gains that inferential cognition of emptiness, it's ordinarily on the path of accumulation of the 5 paths. So then it gets thinner even as one progresses on the path of accumulation. And then there comes a point where one unifies calm abiding and special insight. That's the path of preparation. And there are 4 levels. My point just is that through that process, it's like that's how they're like wearing away. They keep meditating on emptiness over and over again, wearing away that veil or that dualistic component. Does that get at what you were? Did you have a comment? This one?
Yeah, but I don't remember what it was.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
Um, I'll just continue on with the other 2 points. These are fun, though, aren't they? Like,
Yeah.
they're interesting
Talk about this
to
further.
think about. And that's the point here. I just want to say is these are topics to think about, right? That's why is my tray of presenting them. It's not to make us go, wow, that's, it's that if you contemplate these, that's what was, that's the process of understanding. To understand emptiness, you have to ask these questions of yourself over and over, and the point is like nobody can, like it's funny. I thought that like when I be with kids from show, I think I know he knows the answer. So I was like, oh, just tell me the answer, and it's like, point is that even if he says the answer, it's not the answer for me. You have to come to that answer through your own contemplation, right? You have to do it, you have to do the work, we have to do the work ourselves of understanding these difficult points and of getting it wrong and then going, wait a second, that's not quite it. And and over and over again until we understand it through our own experience. It's not a purely intellectual question. It's a question for deep personal reflection that transforms you by contemplating, if that makes sense. That's the kind of question these are. So the next one in the list of 3 is it says, because the excellent qualities are undifferentiable, is how it says here. So what does that mean? So it's Gyaltsab J, his commentary says, in this text, they talk about 32 qualities of a Buddha, which we'll get into when we get to that section. But he says the 32 qualities are inseparable and of one entity with this. So what does that mean? The activities and qualities of a Tathagata are, that's the activity. So the point here that they're getting at is that because next will be the activity. So because it's the qualities is the 6th of the 7 Vajra points, right? After enlightenment comes the qualities, then the activities. So the point is that the qualities of a Buddha, right, of a Buddha's mind are, and again, what this is exploring in a way is the line, or the harmony, the relationship between conventional truth and ultimate truth. Is the various qualities of a Buddha, which are limitless, they say, right? The qualities of Buddha are limitless. So, and one point, both I think Asanga and his commentary and also Gyaltsab J say, so there are various points here. One is, it's funny, is they say like, the qualities of Buddha themselves are inconceivable and infinite, yet texts have to list them for ordinary beings to begin to think about them, right? So you have to sort of list some of the qualities and sort of describe them so that ordinary people like us can start to think about what they are. And yet if you start to list, like if you say, like if I'm saying, well, how do you understand infinity? 1, 2, 3, 4, right? It's like, well, by saying 1, 2, 3, 4, you can't understand infinity. But if you want to understand infinity, it helps to understand numbers. So it's useful to say 1, 2, 3, 4 to understand those. Okay, those are numbers, like a little bit, like a little kid, right? Oh, these are 4. Yeah, you try. Yeah, you're doing that with your kids. Yeah. We have to start there, right? And it's like that. We're like kids in that sense, right? That's one point. So it's the qualities of a Buddha are inconceivable, but you start with a list of 32 qualities. So there's a list of 108 qualities. There are various lists in I can remember the numbers in the Abhisamaya Alamkara. There are longer lists, but different texts have different lists. Yeah. That's one point. But then there's a subtler point being gotten at here, which is the Buddha's mind, right, is in part a wisdom directly perceiving emptiness. And this is what I was saying, Ryan, when you were talking about this is the one that was getting at what you were talking about. And the Buddha's mind that conceives all conventionalities is of one entity with that. That's what I was saying a minute ago, right? A few minutes ago. How can that be? How can it be that two aspects of the Buddha's mind, which are of one nature, one is directly perceiving something non-dualistic, a non-dualistic perception of emptiness, which is a mere absence of intrinsic nature, and at the same time, and what's actually, if you think about it, right, like it's very strange to think about. It actually is inconceivable, isn't it? It's like, if because conventional, when we say the Buddha knows conventional reality, right? If like, I don't know, if 1,000 people are at a concert, right? Each of those 1,000 people is having a different experience in any given moment of the concert, right? And when we say a Buddha is omniscient, we're not saying the Buddha knows there's a concert going on. What we're saying is that the Buddha knows that the ultimate nature of all those beings' minds is emptiness. At the same time, the Buddha knows each of those beings' individual experience in that moment of that concert, right? Each of which is different, right? Like, so one person's thinking this is the best, one person's feeling moved and feeling this is the best song I ever heard. And somebody else is thinking, oh, when is the song gonna be over? It's really boring and I want to hear another song. And the Buddha is simultaneously perceiving the emptiness of intrinsic nature of his or her own mind and of all the concert goers. I'm just using an example of a concert here, and of all the concert goers' minds. At the same time, is directly, not inferential, not conceptually, but is directly perceiving each being's individual experience in that moment of the concert. I'm just giving an example. That's one, and actually, by the way, qualities of Buddha, that's just one, right? Is omniscient. Then there's a quality of compassion in the Buddha's mind, right? The Buddha has equal compassion for hell beings and for hungry ghosts and for presidents and for prime ministers and for soldiers and for victims, and and the Buddha knows each of their experience, right? So the Buddha has equal compassion for the person being, say, being bombed and for the person dropping the bomb, and knows what's going on in each of their minds and knows that their mind is empty. I'm just giving examples. These are examples of the Buddha's qualities, right? There are many other qualities. The Buddha knows the comings and goings of beings, knows directly where their previous lives were and what their karmas are that they're headed towards and what their dispositions are. And the Buddha knows all those things simultaneously in one entity.
Well,
No, and
it's about.
it's a different kind of mind, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Because if you could see everything all at once, well, we couldn't because it would drive us crazy. I mean, you actually, I mean, it's one of the reasons why there's a path in the stages. Because if you got it all at once, and I'm disregarding karma now, I know there may be, but we'd be insane.
I'm thinking about it, like. We're labeling, like, go back to the concert example. The Buddha being able to see the emptiness of the experience of everybody at the concert and at the same time perceive the individual experience of each, like, conventional experience of each person. To us, we label those as two separate things from our side, because we see all things dualistically, it's conventional. From the Buddha side, that wouldn't be two different things. And so even though we can't conceive of it because it's two different things at the same time, it's not two different things at the same time to him. It's actually the same. Okay.
Language.
Yes, and that's what's difficult, isn't it? Is like, because what you're getting at,
So we can't perceive the world from the Buddhist side because we're not Buddhists. We don't have that experience. All we can do is conceptualize it, but that in itself takes you away from actually understanding.
and a few points away. One is, and we have that potential to do that. It's one point, right? And the other is like, again, it's just hard, isn't it? Though, I mean, because like we say, right, from a convention, from an ordinary being's mind, those two things are of one nature, right? The conventional truth is not a separate from the nature. There's the ultimate truth is not separate from the conventional truth. They don't have two separate natures, right? That's why in the Heart Sutra it says form is empty, emptiness is form, which is similar to what you were just saying, right? They're of one nature. Yeah, and the Buddhist, I guess it's just interesting, isn't it? That's where you're getting a similar, different phrasing for the same point, where they say the Buddha perceives those things non-dualistically.
Yeah.
It's a similar kind of point, isn't it?
Yeah,
I guess this goes back to earlier question, the influential realization of emptiness. That's the first step. And then well, I don't know if we're gonna take it or not. It's like somewhere along the line, hopefully we'll get to the direction. But that's a good first step.
Yeah. And it's a necessary first step, they say. Yeah.
You can meditate, have an inferential understanding, realization of emptiness. Does dependent arising disappear? seems like it would, but.
I mean, I think that's getting at this kind of question, right? Because it depends what we mean by dependent arising, right? Like there is, like from one, because what she was asking, I don't know if you could hear it, was does dependent arising disappear when you have an inferential cognition of emptiness? That's what you were asking, right? And on the one hand, I said, right, we were talking about that like only a mere absence of intrinsic existence is appearing to that person's mind, not some conventional sort of, you're not thinking about how seeds lead to trees. So from that perspective, you would that was my mistake actually when I asked that question on conservation. I thought, well, so it must disappear because I'm not thinking about, you wouldn't be thinking about seeds leading to trees. You'd be thinking about you'd only have the perception of the lack of intrinsic existence. And I think part of what Majamaka thinkers are saying is that mere absence of intrinsic existence is the final meaning of dependent arising. That's what dependent arising actually is, that we don't understand. So they would say, they might say, I'm not sure, in other words, but you could sort of say, the way Kansubashi said is they're synonyms. Emptiness and dependent arising. I said, are they synonyms or does one understanding one lead to the other? And he said, no, they're synonyms, meaning that the real meaning of dependent arising is emptiness, actually. So it does, in that sense, it doesn't disappear. It's just you're finally actually getting what dependent arising really means, which is things have no intrinsic nature. So it's a subtle distinction, but an important one.
Well, the way we.
Yeah, I mean, from one perspective, of course, somebody's contemplating first on dependent arising and then finally realizes, say, emptiness in this case. From another perspective, that's from one perspective, right? From another perspective, you would say, no, they haven't. It's not that they thought about it and then realized it. It's that now they actually, at that point they are still, you can't say they're thinking about dependent arising, but they're realizing dependent arising because they're realizing emptiness because they're the same thing. And the last of these 4 points is the way it says it in the text here is because the deeds are spontaneous and non-conceptual. And that's where there are numerous things that are said. So it says the activities of a Tathagata are immeasurable, inconceivable, inexpressible by words. The Buddhas are present in all the Buddha fields. Each Buddha is present in all Buddha fields and is equal to all the Buddhas. Their activities occur beyond any effort or exertion. They are utterly free of all conceptual thought, being as vast as space, free of differentiations as being the activity on the level of ultimate truth. So there are various points here that are inconceivable or difficult or inscrutable. One is the Buddha's activities are infinite. That's difficult to understand. Another is, this one's quite, I find, oh, sorry, there was another question. Anna, did you have a question? I just realized you had your hand up earlier and
Yes, we talk about the Buddha qualities. So you use the concept words. So can Buddha know each individual's, not just previous lives, can we see everyone's future lives?
yes. Yep. Yeah, they say that the Buddha sees 3 times, so the past, present, and future. So the Buddha can see where beings' past lives were, but also what the beings' future lives will be. And one point they say though is, and if a being's future lives are determined already by karma, then the Buddha can see that. If the being's future lives are not yet determined, something in the future is not, then the Buddha sees that. Sees, oh, this being will definitely go to this realm. But the Buddha can also, that's why in some sutras you'll read it where they'll say the Buddha predicted the future enlightenment of a certain bodhisattva, but then they'll say of another bodhisattva, they said it's not yet determined, meaning the karma is not yet complete, so they don't know. It's not that they don't know, it's that it's unknowable yet. It's not yet. Actually, I once asked Kenshin Rinpoche about that. I said, what does it mean? Because I was asking about free will, actually. And he said, I was sort of trying to understand that. And he said, what he pointed out was, he said, the Buddha sees the future. He said, but you don't understand what future means. And he said, future in Buddhism means that which will happen.
Oh, so.
So if the causes are complete for something,
Yeah.
then it will happen. And that's unstoppable. And they say if the causes don't exist yet for a certain thing, then it's not future. It's just a non-existent yet, as of now. And when the causes become complete, then that thing becomes a future phenomena. So future means a future phenomenon. So like if a being has a certain karma to say go to lower realms, I'll give an example, then the Buddha sees this being will go to the lower realms. Or if a being has a future karma to go to a pure land, then the Buddha sees this being will go to a pure land. But there are cases where there is no, it's what's the word, where the causes are not yet set. And then the Buddha sees, oh, this is a being whose causes are not yet, so there are certain sutras where it says that, like a bodhisattva, it says was not ready for a prediction. It means there wasn't, the Buddha couldn't yet say when that being will become enlightened. They would know the being is going to become enlightened, but they couldn't say when yet because there were certain choices that being was still going to make, that would determine when they'll become enlightened. So it's quite interesting. So the Buddha sees the future, but the future means that which is going to happen. In Buddhism, it doesn't mean that there's no free will because there are certain things that are not yet determined. They're not future then. It's funny, isn't it? The definition of future. I never thought of it. What is the definition of future? It means that which will happen. So it means a future phenomenon, right? But it's interesting that some things are not yet future phenomena, even though, But okay, and so this last point, right? So the one point I was making is the Buddha's activities are immeasurable and infinite. That's one point. Another point is that they are present in all the Buddha fields. And but another point I wanted to get to, this one is I think worth contemplating, is Buddhas spontaneously and naturally manifest in a manner to benefit students, disciples, those to be trained, but they do so without any conceptual thought. They do so without any deliberation, without any deliberation or conceptuality. And I'll remind us again, because I said, what's the future? For this point, I find that difficult. Because the Buddha uses words, right? But the Buddha teaches in words, right? Oftentimes. But the Buddha teaches in words without any conceptual thought. And one thing I'll remind us of, for those who study Buddhist philosophy, is, there are different definitions, there are different ways of defining it, but in general, conceptuality means viewing, what's the word? Terms or, sound generality, actually they call it sound generality, which means sound, right? And meanings, so ideas, and also certain phenomena as suitable to be mixed together. So they think so conceptual thought means, like if I say democracy, right? That's a sound, actually, right? Like democracy is just a sound. Then there's a meaning that any given person ascribes to that sound, right? And then you think that they're mixed together, that the sound and that meaning are mixed together somehow. And then you might also think they're mixed together in relation to the United States or Iran or England or India or whatever, right? So conceptual thought means, so one point is that the use of sound is not conceptual. The use of language is not conceptual in and of itself. What's conceptual is viewing sound and meanings as mixed, as suitably mixed. So when we say a Buddha has no conceptual thought, that means the Buddha doesn't do that. Doesn't mean the Buddha doesn't use language. That's the interesting point, right? Because the Buddha perceives things directly, not conceptually. So the Buddha doesn't mix together sound and meaning generalities, though the Buddha uses sound to benefit beings, is the idea in part. And then they say the Buddha's activities suit each disciple without conceptuality. All the Buddha's perceptions are direct perceptions. There's no dualistic conceptualizing. And they use certain metaphors in one of the texts. They say it's like the Buddha's activities are like rain falling from the sky, or like the activity of a wish-granting gem, spontaneous, natural, and without conceptuality, right? So rain doesn't fall because it thinks it wants to fall. It falls when the conditions are set. And there was another note I made. Oh, no, that comes later. There's another point made later about the Buddha's activities. So I don't want to, I'm trying to think, I want to make sure I'm not mixing together where I present different ideas. Yeah, no, that comes later. So, anyway, those are the 4 points of inconceivability, or yeah, inconceivable points that are worth, and my point here is, why is the Maitreya present them? I would suggest these are points for contemplation, for meditation, right? And if you contemplate and meditate on them, I spent longer on them because I think they're interesting and they're worth contemplating. And if we contemplate them, it'll help us understand the nature of our own mind, is the idea, right? Because it'll help us understand what is the relationship between conventional reality and ultimate reality. And that's what some of you have been doing by asking these questions and contemplating. And that's how that process that we've all been doing together is part of, even whether we get it right or we get it slightly, we won't get it fully right until we realize emptiness. So we're always going to get it, however we get it is going to be imperfect until it's perfect, until it's perfected. But that process, they say, one of the practices of the perfection of wisdom is questioning. The Prajnaparamita, those of the 6 perfections, is so asking these questions again and again and contemplating them again and again is part of the practice of how you progress. So that's worthwhile. So those 4 points are to be thought about. And then I'll just continue on a little more. So it says the basic element, so that's again the Tathagatagarbha, the Buddha nature, that is to be realized, the realization, the branches of excellent qualities of a Buddha, the deeds that are for the sake of realization. In this order of 4, the first point is the cause, and the other 3 are conditions for purification. So I said that earlier, right? So, and then now I'm going to explain this, though, and it's kind of funny. I find this interesting too. So it's saying the basic element, the Buddha nature, is the cause, is the substantial cause of enlightenment. And then the other 3, somebody else having achieved enlightenment and them having the qualities of enlightened being and doing the activities of an enlightened being, are the conditions necessary for you. You have to relate to such a being in order to help yourself awaken, right, your Buddha nature. You can't just do it independent of somebody else helping you, is one point. But then Gyaltsab Je, and therefore when Khentrul gave the commentary, he followed Gyaltsab Je. So Gyaltsab Je, Tsongkhapa's disciple, says something quite interesting now. He says, here we say Buddha nature is the cause, substantial cause of you becoming enlightened. And then Gyaltsab Je says, but actually Buddha nature is not literally the cause. And he says, why is that? And this gets into the Buddhist teachings on the nature of causal relationships. We sometimes say, for example, like, well, anyway, I won't get into that yet. Buddhist teachings say for something to have causal efficacy, for it to be able to actually give rise to a result, it must be an impermanent phenomenon. Something, a functioning thing, right? Like a seed gives rise to a tree, or parents can give rise to a child. They're impermanent phenomena. And then Gyaltsab Je says, actually, Buddha nature is emptiness, right? It's the emptiness of your own mind. Therefore, it's not an impermanent phenomena. It's not changing instant by instant. It's a mere negation. Negations aren't functioning things. So it can't serve as a cause for something else. And so he says, so here Maitreya is saying it's the cause, but if you use reasoning, you have to say, well, wait a second, it can't actually serve literally as a cause because it's not an impermanent phenomena that sort of can give rise to something else in the next instant. It's a mere emptiness of the mind. And then he says, Gyaltsep Je points it out, he says, if you realize your own Buddha nature, which is the emptiness of your own mind, which is the ultimate truth mingled with taints, meaning the ultimate truth of the mind of a being who still has mental afflictions. That realization of the nature of your mind will eventually lead to all the excellences of becoming a Buddha. And so he says, actually, it's the mind itself. In other words, the mind is a functioning thing, an impermanent thing. And it's the mind that realizes Buddha nature that's literally the cause. So because Buddha nature is an emptiness, right? It's the emptiness of your mind. That doesn't have causal efficacy. But when your mind, which does have causal efficacy, right? In other words, right now our mind has causal efficacy in the sense that it gives rise to all kinds of mental afflictions. And when your mind realizes its own Buddha nature, that will be the actual, literal, substantial cause of becoming achieving the Dharmakaya. And he says, so the way then he says, Khenchen Rinpoche explained the same point. He said, Buddha nature is not literally the substantial cause of enlightenment. It's only this in a figurative sense, like a metaphor. Buddha nature is emptiness, which is unconditioned, and so does not have causal efficacy. Only impermanent things can serve as actual causes. But the meditation on emptiness and the realization of emptiness is the actual cause. And Khenchen Rinpoche further explained, he said, the actual material cause of enlightenment or the Dharmakaya is a wisdom mind, a mind realizing nature. This is the actual cause of Buddhahood. So one point is that's a philosophical sort of reflection that's true and valid, and that Gyaltsep Je is a very precise philosopher, so he's somebody who will point out these kind of things. But there's an implication from that, which is something you guys have all gotten at today, people whose questions have gotten at, which is, so if you want to realize enlightenment, actually the immediate substantial cause would be the wisdom mind of a being, who's on the 10th bhumi, actually, wouldn't it? So there's a bodhisattva like Maitreya, who's on the 10th bhumi, and when they enter their final meditation on emptiness, that's the immediate substantial cause. And when they finish that meditation on emptiness, they've achieved the Dharmakaya. They're no longer meditating. You could say they finished their bodhisattva reflection on meditation on emptiness because they've become a Buddha and achieved the Dharmakaya. That's the immediate substantial cause. But now you go back, and Khenchen Rinpoche and other lamas made this point. You go back and you say, well, that depends. What was the cause of that? It was the meditation on emptiness of a 9th bhumi bodhisattva, and so on, right, all the way down to the 1st bhumi, where you've realized emptiness directly in meditative equipoise, in direct realization. But now we get to us, and this is, I think, quite useful here. So how do we create the cause? Right? I'm not a 10th bhumi bodhisattva, so I don't have that substantial cause. If I did, that'd be quite wonderful, but I don't possess that ability. And so part of the point here is where it says, what's the substantial cause? Right now, every time you meditate on emptiness, you're creating the cause to eventually gain the inferential cognition, which we talked about, which will eventually lead you to the direct perception, which will eventually lead you to the various bhumis of a bodhisattva. So every single time you reflect deeply on or meditate on emptiness, that's the cause, actually. And so this isn't something distant, is the point here I'm getting at. That's, I think, quite useful to think about. On the one hand, we can say, well, the actual substantial cause of the realization, which talks about in this verse, right, is the realization of a Buddha, not just some level of realization, but the realization here means enlightenment, so it means Buddhahood. That can seem far away, but it's not far away, right? Because what this is getting at, in a way, if you reflect on it, is it's all like you have Buddha nature already. That's primordially with you, right? With us, with each of us. We need someone else who's achieved enlightenment, especially to give teachings, right? There's the qualities of that being lead to their activities. The most important activity, as it says in many texts, is their teaching, especially their teaching on emptiness, right? So what this is saying then is each time you listen to and then go meditate on or contemplate, contemplate on and then meditate on that teaching on emptiness of the Buddha, you're creating a cause that will purify your Buddha, the adventitious stains that cover your Buddha nature, and that will lead you to eventually gain the inferential cognition, and then the direct cognition, and then so on, and will eventually lead to Buddhahood. And that's why, it's quoting Aryadeva in his 400 stanzas has a very famous quote that His Holiness Dalai Lama often mentions, and the Lama Tsongkhapa quotes in Lamrim Chenmo. It says, he's teaching the Forger verses on the Middle Way. It's a commentary on Nagarjuna's teachings on emptiness. And Aryadeva says, even a mere doubt about this matter meaning emptiness, tears samsara to shreds. And what he's getting at is what we're talking about is, you don't, when you have a doubt about it, you haven't realized it, right? But even that doubt is the cause, right? That leads to further questioning. That then
Chain
leads
reaction.
Yeah, exactly. The chain reaction. Good way to put it. And that's what we're cultivating. So you see what we're getting at here, this verse that's saying, the first point is the cause, the other three are conditions. So we have this amazing moment right now. If you think about this verse, and that's where all the teachings of the Buddha, right? They say if you study the Lamrim, the stages of the path to enlightenment, then all the teachings of the Buddha will dawn for you as personal instruction. There's part of the benefit of studying Lamrim. There's a teaching that says if you study the stages of the path, then all the teachings of the Buddha will dawn for you as personal instructions, which is a beautiful line. And that's like this, right? Because in other words, if you think about it, then you can understand, wow, like I have this unbelievable precious human rebirth where I've come across this. In other words, I've had Buddha nature for countless eons. Finally, right now, I've come across the necessary conditions to awaken that Buddha nature, which is I've come across an enlightened being, Buddha Shakyamuni, right? Who taught and had the enlightened activities. And so I've heard the teachings on the view. And then you would feel, wow, I don't want to, in other words, you don't want to waste any time. Like, because it's like your Buddha nature is not going anywhere. But if you don't let it interact with the teachings of a Buddha, it won't awaken and you won't achieve enlightenment. But now your Buddha nature, which has existed primordially, has come across the correct conditions, right? The Shakyamuni Buddha's teachings. So you have this precious moment. And so then you would, if you understand the meaning of this verse, you would feel, wow, now is the time to meditate on emptiness. Now is the time to let my mind interact with emptiness. And it's that we don't, like, I think I might have mentioned this to a couple of people. I mentioned this once, but I was once talking to somebody I knew who had gone on a retreat and gained the inferential cognition of emptiness. I knew that about them. I had that experience, and they were saying, one thing they said to me was, they said, it's so strange. Nobody, people get the teaching, but they don't go do that. Why wouldn't people do that? It doesn't make sense to me. Like, you can have the realization of emptiness, you have this unique moment. And they say, nobody really asks, like, how do you do it? They just sort of study a little bit, but they don't really, they maybe don't think they can or something. And they said, how strange that was. They were just sort of sharing their experience. They said, they look around, they think, wow, what an odd thing if you finally have the opportunity to awaken your Buddha nature, so to speak. And so that's what this verse is getting at, is you're that person. You have the cause already within you. Now you come across the conditions. It's amazing. That's what this verse is saying. And maybe I'll just cover one more point unless there's a question. Because then it says, now we start the next section, which is the fourth Vajra point, right? Which is the basic element, or the Tathagata essence, right? And it says the Tathagata essence, so we're just starting that new section. So we're up to the fourth of the seven Vajra points. It says the Tathagata essence briefly explained by 3 points. It's gonna be a long, most of the rest of the chapter is gonna be on the Takata essence, so it's just starting it, but it says, here it's briefly mentioned according to 3 points. Because the activities of the Dharmakaya are pervasive, because suchness is undifferentiable, and because beings have the lineage, all sentient beings have the Buddha essence. So it's saying, first of all, right, obviously the last line is the most obvious of these three, right? All sentient beings have the essence of a Buddha within them, right? Have Buddha nature. And it's giving 3 reasons for that. And there's at least time to cover the first, which I just think I want to, actually I'll cover it because I think it's something interesting to think about. So I'll cover this one and we'll see if we can see the other 2, it doesn't matter. But this first point is kind of radical, I think. And Gyaltsab explains it as follows. He says, the activities of the Dharmakaya, right, of the perfectly enlightened Buddha, who himself has attained the fruition by realizing the path that purifies the element, the primary, the Buddha nature, radiate and pervade all sentient beings. So if we elaborate for a second, what it's saying? It's saying all sentient beings are proclaimed as having Tathagata Garbha, since they have it by way of a susceptibility to the permeation by the activities of the truth body of a Buddha. So what is that saying? It's saying something kind of bizarre in a way, right? Remember earlier I said like everybody, the Buddha's awareness pervades everybody at a concert. It also pervades everybody who's asleep. It pervades everybody who's fighting. It pervades everybody who's sad and who's happy. So this is making a strange, I think strange to think about, but fascinating point, which is, first of all, the Buddha's mind is right there, right here. The Buddha's in the Manjushri Namasamgiti text. It says, the Buddha's awareness pervades you. The Buddha's awareness pervades, sees your awareness. So it's right there. Sometimes we invoke the Buddha, and that's good practice. But actually, I think it's funny actually. Invoking the Buddha in one way is just we do it in tantric practice. You do that, and also, invoke the Buddha into a statue or something. And it's good to do that. It's a good practice, but it's actually done because we don't know, right? Because it's done for beings who are dualistic. So we think the Buddha is somewhere else, and so I have to invoke the Buddha here because I feel so distant from the Buddha, right? But the Buddha is already right there. You don't have to, actually, the Buddha is present when non-invoked, also equally present when non-invoked. But you're invoking the Buddha, convince your own mind. And there's this whole practice sometimes where you do, like, you imagine the Buddha, and then you said, you imagine the Buddha's coming and dissolving, and then you imagine the Buddha's pouring nectar, and then you imagine the Buddha's again dissolving. And it's just because it's really hard to convince you, to convince us ourselves that the Buddha is already here. So this is, first of all, this is saying that the Buddha pervades you. That makes sense, right? So one point about why do you have the Buddha element, right? What is it that Gyaltsab, here it's Maitreya is saying, is one proof that you have the Buddha nature, or one argument, one sort of debate point, is that the Buddha's awareness already pervades you. And then it says, it elaborates further, it says also, you have some degree of receptive capacity. All beings have some degree of receptive capacity to the Buddha's activities. Of course, some of us, like there's a metaphor again in the Lamrim text where it's a metaphor of like they say like the kinds of cup. Maybe you've heard that teaching. It says, ideally there are 3 faults of a cup that's upside down. But actually, it's funny, even an upside down, you can't receive the teachings. That's the point. But even upside down cup, a little moisture will get in. Then it says, don't be a leaky cup, where you pour the teachings in and forget, right? But even a leaky cup, as the water's pouring through it, gets a little moisture. And then it says, and don't be a dirty cup, like where you're in, like a dirty cup, like if you're trying to drink water, but the cup has some poop in it or something, it's not gonna be very good to drink. But still there'll be water there, and water isn't the nature of poop. It could be purified, so all kinds of cups do accumulate some, even faulty cups accumulate some water, is the metaphor I'm using from the Lamrim to avoid this point. But what it's actually saying, when Khenpo Rinpoche was elaborating on this verse, he said, there are no beings totally devoid of virtue. that even the worst beings have some virtue. And then the commentary said something that I find provocative, so I want to share it today. This part to think about is they say that whether it's direct or indirect, that the way Gyal Tsubji said it was all virtue done anywhere is due to the governing cause of the Buddha's Dharmakaya. And what that's getting at, and what I want to say a couple implications of that, right? That means that this is obvious, isn't it? That the Buddha's activities are not exclusively Buddhist, right? Which is obvious, but it's good to remind ourselves, because what it's saying is like that it's actually maybe I'll just share a brief reflection on this. I think I've often contemplated this point in the sense of growing up in a in a non-Buddhist culture myself, as many of us, like all of us probably have. Seriously, it's right. Like I've been thinking about this lately, actually, in the last few years, that there's sometimes a danger in like storage, like going off on a little tangent here, but many sometimes I'll say a few things. One is I've actually been thinking about this a lot. One is I think I think calling Buddhism a religion is problematic. I think it's a product of that Buddhism was come across by British really initially in the context of imperialism, right? I mean, they literally took over India, making that up, right? It was like British versus India. And so they labeled Buddhism according to their categories to take things, really. That's what's happening. I was thinking about it, I thought of when the Dalai Lama says that Mao said to them, religion is poison. And I was like, wow, Mao was influenced by the Russians, who were influenced by the British, and he thought he didn't understand what Buddhism was. I was like, Mao was a person from China who didn't understand what Buddhism was. He was thinking, he was copying like Stalin's rhetoric. It's like, how strange. Like I was just started reflecting on this whole process of like cultural meetings. It's like very strange to me as I think about it, to be honest. I'm just trying to off on a tangent here, but and then also, India has this, it's only Dalai Lama often points out, India has this amazing tradition of usually, not always perfect, but on average, quite good pluralism religiously. And part of that, which I always find fun in a way, in India, everybody can just say, like, Hindus will say, well, Buddha is an avatar of, Vishnu, I think it is.
I see that. I've been in Nepal and
Yeah.
I've heard somebody say, "Oh, Buddha, he's my favorite god."
And Buddhists will, and similarly, a Buddhist can say, "Oh, Jesus is a bodhisattva." Many Buddhists will say that, or so and so. This other person's a bodhisattva. That Indian traditions. I don't want to call them religions. Indian faiths. I prefer faiths because Buddhists, we cultivate faith. So I actually think it's a better term for Buddhism's a faith, but I don't think it's a religion. The Buddhist faith, by its nature, is non-exclusivist in that sense, right? Like, and this is the Buddhist teaching saying that. This Buddhist teaching is saying wherever somebody's encouraging virtue, doesn't matter if you're a Muslim or a Christian or a Jewish or a Hindu, or you're a scientist who's researching altruism, they're saying this text is saying that's under the influence of the Dharmakaya, right? So there's room for that. And as a Buddhist, we're going to say it's, but actually, what is the Dharmakaya? It's emptiness, right? So it's under the influence of reality. In one sense, you could say that. One way of saying it is because it's realistic. Maybe, I don't know. It is true. Actually, altruism is realistic. So this is saying Buddha nature, right? If you go back to the actual text, you have Buddha nature because you're susceptible to goodness. Right? Which is, and that every time you see yourself be a little bit susceptible to goodness, that's a proof that you can take for yourself that you have Buddha nature. And if you see somebody else be susceptible in a moment, even to goodness, then you can say, oh, wow, they have Buddha nature. So it's the first of the three proofs or arguments or debate points or contemplations to say, how do you know everybody has Buddha? You could say, because we're about to start studying Buddha nature. So I just want to introduce it. Right. So if you were to say to somebody, well, how do you know everybody has Buddha nature? The first of the 3 points that Maitreya is saying is because the activities of the Dharmakaya are pervasive. And again, I'm just pointing out, like, this isn't, I just want to say, like, because the reason why I mentioned the cultural part is this isn't saying, when it says the activities of the Dharmakaya are pervasive, this is absolutely, positively, 100% for clear, 100% for certain, not saying Buddha's the creator God who's making everybody a Buddha. That's not, given that we all came from different cultures, it'd be easy to misunderstand that. And this is not saying that. This is actually what it's really saying is reality and wisdom pervade everywhere. And if you're in touch with reality, you can cultivate goodness. And if you can cultivate goodness, that proves you have Buddha nature, the capacity for good. And if you have capacity for some good, you have capacity for more good. And if you continue that, eventually you have capacity for limitless goodness, which is Buddhahood. So that's one argument for Buddha nature, which I think is quite beautiful, and also gets at fundamental point about one fundamental truth of Buddhism, right? Which is that's why with the Dalai Lama can go around, he says, don't become Buddhist, become Buddhist. I don't care. I'm not here to convert anybody to Buddhism. That's not the point. The point is to be a good person, right? Why is the Dalai Lama saying that? Because that's Buddhist teaching, actually, right? Yeah, anyway, so I'm going on a tangent, but you get my point there.
Kindness is my religion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Kindness. And what we're saying is, like, yeah, anyway, and kindness is the essence of every religion, right? Which is actually interesting, isn't it? Because it's redefining, in one way, that's redefining religion, because of course somebody else could say my religion is not kindness, so it's redefining, then you'd have to say, then that's not religion. I don't know. Anyway, it's an interesting debate. But we should probably stop this while we're so let's just do our dedication. And I just realized this. I was just finishing my schedule for January, something else yesterday, trip. So I'll send out to Gabe today or tomorrow a calendar for future classes, because there aren't any on the website. I just realized that was it wasn't an oversight. I was actually scheduling a trip to see my mom, so wasn't sure when I was going, so I just scheduled it. So now we can do that. So I'll send that out soon. So I apologize for not having done it sooner. Let's do the dedication. So the supreme jewel bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all pervade. In the snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness. What's the rest of it? All powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. That's it. Then through these virtuous merits, which are merely labeled totally empty from their own side, may the I, which is merely labeled totally empty from its own side, achieve Buddha's enlightenment, which is merely labeled totally empty from its own side, and lead all sentient beings who are merely labeled totally empty from their own side to the state of enlightenment as quickly as possible. In particular, right, through these studies, may all of us succeed in allowing our Buddha nature to be influenced by the teachings of Shakyamuni Buddha, and thereby be awakened, so that we can realize the nature of our own mind, purify the Buddha element, and achieve enlightenment, thereby become the Buddha jewel for the welfare of all sentient beings. Well, thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
See you all next year for next class.
Thanks, Lauren.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Oh, how